Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. Can everybody hear me? Good? Great. Well, hi, I want to thank all of you for coming tonight. My name is Rebecca. Now can you hear me? Okay, I'll speak directly into it. Thank you. I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. My name is Rebecca Kennedy. I work for the City of Vancouver in the Community Development Department. And we're super excited to be able to put on this event to talk more with all of you in the community about housing, which is something we hear a lot about. We hear that it's too expensive. We hear that we need more of it. We hear that folks have feelings about what it looks like and where it's located. And so we want to talk to all of you about that tonight. We have an awesome panel of folks who are here to talk to us about sort of the state of housing in the state of Washington, but very focused in on Clark County and Vancouver. That's Mike Wilkerson from Eco Northwest over there on the end. And then Patrick Quinton, who's the Economic Development Director for the city, is going to talk to you about all the things the city is already doing to try to address our housing needs. And then we have Ann Fritzell from the Department of Commerce, who's here to talk about new legislation that was passed in the last couple years by the legislature that will impact the city of Vancouver, other cities in Southwest Washington, and the county as well. So again, welcome. Thank you for being here. And I just got to plug that we're doing this as part of our Vancouver, which is the update to the city's 20-year plan. And a big driver of what comes out of that will be housing and the community's need for housing. And so we're excited to have you here and get you involved. I encourage you to sign up to get on the Our Vancouver mailing list so you can learn about other future events. And again, thanks for being here. I'll turn it over to the panel.
Is that working? No. Want me to move it? Wow. There we go. We skipping right ahead here. All right. Good evening, everyone. As Rebecca mentioned, my name is Mike Wilkerson. I work at Eco Northwest, and we're part of the consulting team led by WSP working on the comp plan. And so I'm going to kick off today talking about kind of the need for housing, which I think is known to many, but just putting some data around the problem, contextualizing this isn't something that's entirely unique to Vancouver. It's statewide and national in scale. And starting with, the idea around the process that we're doing, which is a statewide planning process. That process recently changed through some legislation, HB 1220, that kind of provides a framework for thinking about housing need that's much more expansive than it has been previously in the under growth management in Washington state. And so that all starts with the state coming up with an estimate of need. And that is through a period of 2045. So it's 20 years basically starting in 2025 through 2045, and that's 1.1 million households that are needed across the state. From there, each county is effectively assigned its share of the projected growth. And so Clark County had a process where they actually adopted a population forecast of 718,000. That's higher than the medium estimate. So each jurisdiction has a low, kind of a medium, and a high, and the county believed that the growth is going to be slightly higher than the medium projection. And then from there, once you know what your household, what your population looks like, you then convert that into households. Households then dictate the demand for housing. And so when you do that process at the county, that's indicating about 116,000 more units of housing that are needed through 2045. The city then, as part of that process, is going to get allocated a share of that growth, and we don't have that yet at the city. So as part of this, we've been working with the city on estimating what we think that housing need might look like, and I think the city is planning for at least 40,000 units of housing through that time horizon. And so we'll talk about contextualizing some of that, but that's just the overall process I think that we're all going to talk about today. This slide is very complicated. I was asked to kind of talk about housing markets and how they work, and I think it's not easy, and this graphic is trying to talk through what that looks like. So I think really what you have is the current stock of your housing, and you can think about that in terms of how affordable it is to the median household, or MFI. And so those are typically thought about as 50% being on the lower end of the continuum, 80% kind of that workforce range, and 100% being, again, that median. And so if you look at the entire stock of housing today in the city, about 13% is affordable to households who make 50% or less of area median income. About 42% is in that 80% to 50% range. 20% is in that 20 to 80% range, and then 20% is at that highest level of affordability of 120% or more. And what happens then is, over time, you have two competing factors at the neighborhood level. One is gentrification. Gentrification is another way of describing appreciation. So that's the pressure of competition in a neighborhood, which increases prices and rents. I think many people are aware of that happening, all around the city. That's the one direction. The other direction is what we call filtering, which is another way of thinking about depreciation. And that's to say, when the market isn't as competitive, you can see prices relatively getting more affordable over time. And that typically is for older stock of housing being less expensive than new houses that are built or new apartments that are built. So those are the competing factors. That's the most important piece. Everyone wants to focus on new construction, but when you think about new construction, at most that's 1 to 1.5% on an annual basis. And so when you're talking about affordability over time, it's not so much what you're building new, which is where all the attention focuses. It's that competing force between gentrification and filtering that are much more impactful in terms of understanding overall price and rent trajectories. So that's a simplified version of that, and happy to talk about questions later. So again, when we think about filtering, this is the benefit of a properly functioning housing market. And we don't observe that in all instances. And so in Vancouver, we want to understand how much is filtering happening. And filtering, again, is prices becoming more affordable over time as that unit becomes older. And the literature looks at this across a variety of markets across the US and consistently finds that filtering is happening, but it happens more in markets that are normally functioning and less constrained, and happens at a really small extent in markets that aren't well functioning. And so here, we can look at every unit in the city. That's a one-bedroom apartment, and those are all the dots. And on the right are new buildings. They have higher rent. On the left are older buildings. They have lower rent. And that trend line is kind of showing you what that difference is. And what it works out to in Vancouver is about $10 less per year based on when the building was built. So if you think about an average one-bedroom apartment in the city today is about $1,600. That same building, if it were across the street and it were built in 1990, would be renting for about $1,100. And that's the benefit of having a properly functioning housing market, where you have enough units relative to the demand that the prices become more affordable over time. What that works out to is about 0.5% a year in terms of its area median income. So when we look at the literature is 0.5% is the lowest end that we would expect to see. 2.5% is the highest end. So this is, again, indicating, in Vancouver's case, that the market here is very, very constrained, and filtering is happening at a very small degree relative to what it would be in a less constrained market. One way you can talk about how constrained a market is a term that's called housing underproduction. I think a lot of people say shortage. That's roughly what that is. In order to think about this in the most straightforward terms, it's about how many housing units do you have for every household. And nationally, if we look at that number, it's 1.1. So effectively, there's 10% more housing units than there are households. And why is that? Well, we have vacancy rate, right? The vacancy rate is never zero. There's always going to be some factor of vacancy rate. And then we have about 4% of the stock of housing is second and vacation homes, which aren't available for year-round occupancy. And so if you have 10%, you take 4% away of that as second and vacation homes, you're left with maybe more like a 6% vacancy rate is what you're targeting in a properly functioning market. When we look at Washington State through this lens, Washington State is the third lowest state in terms of that ratio, or the third most constrained housing market of anywhere. And again, it used to be number 2, so it's slightly improved as we've been looking at this over a number of years, but Washington State is below that 6% threshold, which would be the bare minimum. This varies across the state. Clark County is amongst the most constrained when we think about the number of housing units needed as a percentage of the stock of housing, and Clark County is almost 6%. That's higher than most parts of Puget Sound. Maybe Tri-Cities is on par with that level of constraint. So again, this is a statewide problem that's more acute here in Clark County than it is in other parts of the state. What we can look at is, again, our ratio in Clark County is 0.5 vacancy. We want 1.1 is that number. And again, so if you look at measuring Clark County relative to other places, it's at the low end of that continuum. And what we see is, unfortunately, that it's getting worse, not better, since 2010. So if we look at since 2010, how many households have formed versus how many new units of housing we've built, that ratio is 1.03. So 3% vacancy, we're targeting 6%. So again, there's lots of numbers. I think the main takeaway here is Clark County is a very constrained housing market. It's getting worse over time, and that's really impacting broad-based affordability, or what all these data suggest. So what do we see then as the outcome of that? These are all things that I think everyone here knows, experiences personally and through community, that the rental market has changed drastically in Vancouver since 2010. Rents in the city of Portland were higher. So rents in Vancouver in 2010 were about 12% lower on average. And again, average is just average. There's a distribution. Today, the average apartment, it's a one-bedroom unit in Vancouver, is 7% higher than it is in Portland. So we went from being 12% lower to 12% lower to 7% higher. The other way you can think about that is rents have gone up 58% in Vancouver on average versus 30% in Portland. And so when we think about the regional housing market, where Vancouver used to be more affordable, one of the most affordable places in the region, is now actually the most expensive place in the region from a rent perspective. And so that's a big, big change when we're talking about since 2010. This is not since 1980. This is really happening in the last 10 to 12 years. Why that particularly matters is the share of renters in Vancouver is pretty high, more so than in other markets. So in Portland, it's 47%, city of Portland. Here, it's 49%. Seattle's about the only city around where there's a higher share of renters. And so again, when we see affordability decreasing over time, and we have a very high percentage of people who are renting, they're the ones who are most at risk of those pressures and displacement. So again, just contextualizing, the city is much different than the rest of the county. The rest of the county is only 29% renters. So the city of Vancouver has twice the share of renters than the rest of the county. So when we talk about these dynamics in the context of the region, what we're seeing and experiencing in the city is very different than what we're experiencing in the rest of the county. I think then it's no surprise when we talk about costs going up a lot, we can look at that relative to income and see that this is problematic for more than half of renter households. So HUD says you should spend no more than 30% of your gross income on housing. And if you do, you're cost burdened is what that term is. So when we think about cost burdening, we see in the city it's consistently going up over time. And relative to all of these places that we see, rest of Clark County, Portland, Seattle, our rate of cost burdening is the highest of all of these markets. So again, we see we're the most constrained, and that most adversely impacts renter households because of that constraint. On the ownership side, again, prices are continuing to rise very, very quickly. That's in part due to the fact that we do not observe any filtering happening for ownership when we look at the data. We looked at this extensively and tried to say, okay, we see this happening everywhere. This should happen. The literature all says this should be happening. But in Vancouver, when we measure it, we cannot see any filtering. So that is to say, in a neighborhood where homes are built in 1950, they're not any more affordable than a house down the street built in 1960. And that's the benefit of building more housing over decades, and we're not getting that benefit in the city. And we see prices going up much more. These are percentages on the bar. The number is the price point. So the prices in the city are lower than they are in the rest of the county, but they're growing more quickly here in the city than they are in the rest of the county. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, we can think about, and Patrick's going to talk a lot about this coming up in terms of what are the tools that are at our disposal to think about influencing production, how much we're building, where we're building, what we're building. And the answer is, in the city, what we're building today is about 80% multifamily units and 20% ownership product. And what has really increased is multifamily. So we've built roughly the same number of ownership detached homes for the past decade or so, in that, let's say, mid 300 range. Multifamily at times has been in the 500 units a year, grew to 700, grew to 1,000, and now well over 1,000 consistently, so that we're seeing, about 1,700 units built a year over the past many years. And this is, again, a big increase on the multifamily side. What we see is where that housing is being built is in the center city and in the corridors. And this was intentional as part of the last comp plan to really identify where the city thinks growth should be happening, how do they support growth through investments in transportation and other things, all related to those corridors. And we are seeing it's in the corridors, it's all over the place. The color is the year that it was built, the size of the circle is how big it is. And again, you can see the larger circles are concentrated in certain areas, particularly downtown. Some of the smaller circles are smaller units in that, let's say, 0 to 50 range. But again, you can see this is already happening in and around the city at various scales of development. There's a lot going on this chart. The takeaway I would largely say is we are already producing what some people refer to as middle housing. And why I say some people is I think that's a very narrow definition, which is 2 to 4 unit duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes is oftentimes what people refer to as middle housing. It's much more expansive than that, and I think the state through HB 1110 is looking at ways to expand that. But even if we look at that narrow definition, we are already seeing some of that happening in the city today. And so I think, some of the questions, and later there's opportunities to talk about middle housing. We are already seeing middle housing, whether that's accessory dwelling units, ADUs, or plexes happening in and around the city. I think the idea is how much of the production is in that, and it's pretty small relative to larger scale development. And so when we look at the intensity of development, what this map is showing is units per acre. So the darker colors are places that are 10, maybe 20 units per acre. And they're pockets and islands of density is what we see. And so when we look at the city, almost half of the land is exclusionarily zoned. And that means you can only build detached homes on certain lot sizes, et cetera. And so from an opportunity standpoint, half the land cannot be basically added any density to, and it's been concentrated in those pockets. And we really see that on this map, plus the previous map showing where development is happening today around the city. And so when we think about, what's achievable, there's a huge range, and we see various scales of development happening from, on the right, townhomes that are, attached, sometimes can be ownership. That might be 20 units per acre. When we get up into those 4 and 5 story buildings, those can be, 80 or 100 units per acre. So again, there's a huge range, even when we talk about multifamily housing in terms of what that looks like. Okay, last point, what does that mean from a comp plan perspective? And so now through HB 1220, we have very specific guidance on how each jurisdiction needs to calculate need. And the big change here is how we think about income of that need much differently than we have previously. And so there's a tool that basically every jurisdiction can use. And if you put in what you think your share of the growth will be, it will tell you what your need is based on housing for individuals experiencing homelessness, and then looking at the relative affordability of your stock versus what we think incomes are going to be in the future. And that tells you what that distribution is. And again, you can see here, at the highest end, it's 35% of the stock of housing, and that's typically what the market's going to build. The market might still build at that 100 to 120, but you see, large portions of the need are going to be in things that the market, in an unconstrained sense, isn't going to build, other than, let's say, middle housing as an opportunity to start building at a smaller scale that is generally more affordable. And so aligning this need through policy is really one of the highest level objectives of the comp planning process. And just starting with an understanding of the incomes that we're targeting is the first step in that process. So let me turn it over to Patrick. Are we taking questions now, or?
We can take a couple questions if folks have any. Yeah, here,
This is really a generic kind of overview question. If we went from 150,000 in the county in 2000 to quadrupling this year. And I look at these statistics, my background before the birth of Christ was in multiple regression analysis, very, very hard science. So these projections, you said 718,000 by 45, that's an increase? Or is that the overall population in 2045?
That's the overall population.
Okay, so as a listener, as a consumer, I'm sitting here thinking, you guys are bright and you're well-funded, yet it's only a guess. So I'm trying to translate what you're saying here on the screen with the number of people I pass by during the day that are unhoused. Can we do something that would house those people and still use this as an overall goal? Thanks.
I think Patrick's going to directly address that in some of his remarks coming up in terms of like how the city is thinking about that. But I can, certainly on the projection side,
That's fine.
yeah, I mean, I have a PhD in economics. To think that I could project the future in 2045, absolutely cannot. But I think the idea is by planning for growth, right, what you're allowing is that growth to not be a limiting factor on what can get developed. And so if the idea is to allow for capacity for growth, the market is ultimately going to determine what gets built and where. But if it's too constrained, that's what we see happening today, is markets that are too constrained, you don't get the building. I think that's the spirit of that forecast, rather than trying to say that anyone knows with certainty what that number is going to be.
I would say from the state's perspective, the Office of Financial Management has been projecting population for the Growth Management Act, but then the median population projection has been pretty spot on at the county level.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mike. Let me move this closer. So my name is Patrick Quinton. I am the director of the city's Department of Economic Prosperity and Housing. Within that, we manage all of the city's affordable housing programs, as well as the city's kind of strategic redevelopment projects, which is an attempt to build even more housing and other types of development. So we really are kind of on the ground thinking about, okay, how do we respond to these conditions that we're in? So I want to walk you through how we're currently approaching this. And there are people in the room who, I've been with the city for 2 years now, there are people in the room who've certainly been working with the city, as part of the city for many years on our housing deficit, our affordable housing needs. But beginning about 2 years ago, we started actually bringing Mike in and doing this kind of analysis to really get us a better sense for what are we looking at, what is really the need here, what's really going on, and then that began to inform the actions that the city took. We began to form city council's deliberations on this and staff's kind of work on this, and so this is the housing action plan that I want to share with you and give you progress on that. So I'll do a quick summary. Mike's really giving you the overview of the need, but I'll do a quick summary of kind of how we think about it, and then talk about the objectives of housing action. It's not simply what my team does. It's trying to, there's a slide that'll say pull every lever, so get everybody working in the same direction. And then I'm going to walk through some of the highlights of what we're working on, and you can see how comprehensive we're looking at this response, and I'll give you kind of an update on some of the things that we're working on, but also things that are coming up, and then we can open up to questions again. So Mike kind of covered this in terms of the need. I will say that our city council has, in separate actions over the past roughly 12 months, enacted resolutions declaring a housing emergency and a homelessness emergency. So this is as kind of as serious an issue as we have. These are related issues. So when we see people unhoused on the street, it is a direct result. It is a symptom of this housing dynamic, this housing market dysfunction that Mike's talking about. And so we view these as married, like we really have to work on these together. And so we continue to deal with the issues of population growth, not enough supply, so constrained vacancy, a lot of cost-burdened renters in our market. And so with Mike's help, we have roughly quantified the deficit for the city of Vancouver. So this is the shortfall in the number of housing units relative to the overall households in the city of Vancouver as 10,000 units. So that means that if we could build 10,000 units today, right, we could say we've solved this. And so what our goal is here is really to say, okay, how do we close the housing deficit? And once again, getting back to this gentleman's question, we have this 20-year look. Here's what's going to happen over 20 years. We don't want to wait for 20 years to solve this. How can we think of this on a shorter time frame and what really needs to be done? And so based on, once again, the analysis that Mike shared, the city, both from city council down, has adopted a goal that says we need to increase our housing production in the city to 2,500 housing units a year across all types of housing, and at least 1,000 of those units need to be affordable. We define it as affordable to households earning 80% or less of area median income. So this is the goal that we have established, and basically we're saying if we can do this over 10 years, we can hopefully make significant, if not real progress on the housing situation. The challenge we face is that going to 2,500 units per year, as Mike shared our production numbers, we're basically averaging about 1,700 housing units a year. So when you look at that, that's basically a 50% increase in overall production. And that's not what the city does. This is the overall market. So this is what the market is building in our community right now. So collectively, we all have to figure out a way to increase it to this 2,500 number from 1,700. The affordable side is even more daunting because we are producing the affordable housing production is a little more kind of lumpy because there's a lot of, single projects make a big difference, but we average probably 250 to 300 affordable units a year, and we need to get that number to 1,000. So we're talking at least tripling the production of affordable housing. There's a lot of factors that go into that, but this is the goal that we need to meet, both to close the deficit, but also, as Mike pointed out, his last chart was we have to not just increase housing production, we have to increase it in all the different income categories in order to meet the needs of our community. So we decided, after, like I said, a couple of years ago, that we needed to kind of develop a more formal action plan. And what it was designed to do was really establish, one, that this was a citywide priority, not just the priority of my department that says housing in its name, or the community development department, but all departments. So we have fire marshals who inspect buildings. It should be a priority to the fire department to solve the housing crisis. It should be a priority to the public works. So, and then as well as our private sector partners. The other part of it was, how do we grow resources? We know that even if we get more efficient, improve processes, how do we grow resources? So it was a commitment to figure out ways to both find new resources and leverage the resources that we have, and then also to see what we could do on our end to make as many process and policy improvements to make the process of building housing more cost-effective, more efficient. And so this is just a silly clip art graphic, but it's basically just to say we need to pull all the levers. So when we talk about housing, solving the housing crisis, there's a lot of conversations about should we do this or should we do this? And our philosophy is we need to do all of it. We need to do all of it, right? And so we're going to walk you through the different ways that we're thinking about this, but it includes the comp plan, what we're talking about right now, which is primarily a land use exercise. It's a visioning and what we want our community to be, but it really then guides how we use the available land we have. But there's all sorts of processes that we run. Anybody who's applied for a permit knows that. There's policies that we have that govern us, and then we have money. We have both investment dollars, incentive dollars, and then we can innovate. We can create new ideas. We can do a better job of advocating with our colleagues at the state and others. So this is meant to say we have to do all of it. So I'm just going to quickly walk through. This presentation's available, so no one has to take notes on the list, but we just want to walk through some highlights from each of these categories. The first two you see here are the category of land use and our code. Really, what you're doing now, as I just mentioned, is that we are basically gonna update our entire code and like as Mike pointed out, try and pull more of the available land that we have into a state where it can produce more housing, and that includes things around kind of zoning and allowable density and things like that. Like I mentioned, we have a number of policies. We have processes that we use. Anybody, like I said, who's applied for a permit, so we're taking a look at how developers work with us. Some people in the room, I think, participated in a recent forum we had with about 25 to 30 different development partners, and we asked them, what's working, what's not working, let's put everything on the table, and now we have a list of about 10 process improvements that we're going to implement. And there's other things that we're looking at in terms of policies, but our goal is we have objectives and how we regulate the outcomes we want when housing gets built, but we want to eliminate everything else that's not really adding value, that's not needed in the process. The next two categories are the incentives, investments. We run a bunch of programs where we actually invest dollars in affordable housing. So we're trying to both make those more effective and add to that the voters, people in this room, I assume, and the voters in our community voted to renew the affordable housing levy, which provides direct funds for investment in affordable housing projects. That last February, the voters approved that. So we now have another 10 years. We'll collect $10 million a year to do that. That's an incredible tool. There's affordable housing developers in the room here who would tell you that that's one of the critical pieces of investment anytime we build deeply affordable housing. We regularly get resources from the state and federal government to put into affordable housing, and then we're adding other programs that will increase the dollars that are available. You can see them there. On the fee side, we're also trying to take a look at the fees that we charge, and are there ways that we can either minimize those fees or exempt affordable housing or change the way that we charge fees, or can we defer fees? If I were to show you the breakdown of costs for a housing unit, fees occupy a particular percentage of that. If we can knock that percentage down, that increases the number of units that can build. So we're taking a look at all the fees that we charge in our programs. And then the last three categories are, one, we want to be open to new ideas. We want to encourage our development partners and other partners to pursue new ideas. So we're looking at, are there different construction methods that we can help facilitate those? Are there different ways that we can kind of reuse existing properties? Are there new programs that we can establish? So we're trying to be a facilitator for that and encourage that kind of innovation. On the advocacy front, affordable housing, if you think about how affordable housing was built 40 years ago, 50 years ago, there was a massive federal presence in building affordable housing. There needs to be more conversation nationally to state level about what resources are available. We want to be part of that conversation, but we also want to be part of conversations around very specific things. Washington State is an incredibly difficult state to build condominiums. That's why we don't have a lot of condominiums in our community. Condominiums are an important part of the homeownership picture. They're important kind of first opportunity to buy a home. The state legislature made some changes a few years back. We think there should be more changes. We want to be at the table advocating for those changes. And then the last piece of our plan is really just to do a better job of both collecting data on the kind of data that Mike shares with you, on the activities that are happening in terms of housing that's being built in our community, and using it to take corrective action, change what we're doing, but we also want to make it available to you. We want to make it so that anytime you can go to the city website and get a great look at, okay, here's where we're at, here's our housing supply, here's what's in the pipeline, kind of here's what's in the pipeline in different neighborhoods, different housing types, so that it's a community conversation about how well we're doing, and there's accountability for that. I've kind of walked through a number of these, but I did want to just highlight some of the progress that we have made. I mentioned the affordable housing levy renewal. That was an important step. We've updated what we refer to as our multifamily tax exemption program. It's a fundamental tool for multifamily housing projects when they get built. There's a tax exemption available for the owners of those buildings. we updated that to both encourage more affordable housing getting built in that, but we also created another avenue that would allow market rate projects to use the program but pay into a fund that would then reinvest in other affordable housing projects. That fee in lieu fund at the bottom of the list is that new fund that's been created. Like I said, we're accessing other state resources. We are, and there's people in the room from the VHA here, going to put you on the spot, but there's home ownership programs that are being worked on right now that we hope to have available. Home ownership is a big emphasis of what we're trying to do, and we know that the obstacles to home ownership, a lot of it is around down payment assistance, things like that. So we're working with partners on those programs. And then on the policy and process side, obviously comp plan, we've made it easier to build ADUs. We're lowering the threshold or increasing the threshold, I guess, for an environmental review on multifamily projects, which will ease the path for more housing getting built. I mentioned development review, and then our data collection efforts. So I think that was fast, but I know people have questions, and we want to hear Anne's presentation.
Questions? So we will have time for full Q&A with the panel afterward, and then we'll have breakout groups, but we do have time after each person for a couple questions.
Thanks. This more of comments than questions. Mr. Wilkerson said the market will build housing. I think we can't rely on the market only. We have to build some public housing. In response to the gentleman's comment about people living on the streets and in tents, you know, after the earthquake in San Francisco, the city built what was called earthquake shacks. They were built by the Army. They were placed in public places like parks. They built, I think it was 5,600 small, what we would call today tiny homes. That was a public works project, basically. Here in Vancouver during World War II, the Vancouver Housing Authority built hundreds of homes to house workers who were working on the shipyards. And of course, Vanport was built over on the other side of the river. So because we have a crisis right now, we need to be building public housing. We need to leverage all the funds that we can get to do that. One of the things I think we need to do is, you mentioned the state statute that passed last year, and I can't remember which one it is, maybe HB 2811, that basically says you can't have single-family zoning anymore. But I know the city is working on amending our statutes, our city statutes for that, but we shouldn't be waiting to get that process through. I've seen in other areas where it takes too long to get a new ordinance passed. We should be immediately allowing people to build multifamily or duplexes or whatever in single-family zones. I live in a neighborhood where we have really large lots. There are some people who might be willing to split those lots to build on, but under the current zoning, they can't do that. And then lastly, again, in my neighborhood, there was a lot for sale across the street from me that was over 3 acres. Several developers looked at it and said, we can't afford to put we can't afford to build multiple homes on these lots because of the requirements for infrastructure that the city requires. You know, they would have had to put in sewers and sidewalks and street lighting and all that kind of stuff. We as a city need to help pay for some of that infrastructure that would allow for multiple houses in some areas where they otherwise wouldn't be affordable. Thanks.
Thank you.
Do you guys want any response quickly, or?
I guess I would agree. I mean, I think there's a lot of good ideas. In terms of allowing for greater density in single-family zones, I think this process is designed to get us there. I don't so Rebecca could answer that. But I think that's the goal, is to have a public process that talks that through and gets us to the point where we can make those changes. I think there are models that we're seeing, cottage cluster models and others that are building multiple units on single properties. We now allow that. There are builders who can build those type of units. So I do think there's smaller experiments that are happening in response to this. There isn't the same public housing infrastructure that there was back in the day. But I think we do have collectively, we have between Vancouver Housing Authority and other partners, the ability to pull off these different ideas. And part of what we're trying to do is make it possible that these type of innovations can happen. And we have money to put into this. So, we're certainly, we like the ideas and be happy to support them as they come forward.
Take one more and then move on with the panel.
You already touched on this a little bit. I was wondering, how far in the process are we in updating the codes and policies in order to move forward with this plan? Is there an estimate of time of how long that would take?
That's actually me. Yeah. So the comprehensive plan update, it really establishes, where growth will occur, and then it updates our code, our development regulations to allow that and facilitate that. And so we, per state law, have to have that done by June of 2025, which is too long, right? We want to advance some of this stuff sooner, and we will be talking to our council early next year about how we might advance some of it a little sooner. We also recognize, allowing 4 to 6 units on every lot in the city is a conversation that we also need to have with the community. What does that look like? How do we do it? That's single families neighborhoods will not change overnight, right? Middle housing will happen very incrementally. But the regulations around that, we believe we have to have a community conversation about. And so we're going to try to do some stuff fast and go slow to go fast on other stuff so that we have the support of all y'all and the community behind us when we do it. Okay. Ann?
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me? My name is Ann Fritzl. I'm here from the Washington State Department of Commerce. I've been working there for 20 years, working with communities as they update their comprehensive plans and regulations to enact the vision of their community and be consistent with state law. Your legislature has been very busy in the last few years looking at housing actions up and down the West Coast. California, Oregon, even British Columbia, they're all experiencing a housing crisis. And so the legislature has adopted a lot of legislation in the last few years that is aiming at really increasing the supply of housing and meeting the needs of housing, of households at all income brackets. So just a note about the Department of Commerce, we strengthen communities in just about every aspect of community development. So we've funneled billions of dollars of federal and state money every biennium, working on infrastructure, housing. We have the Housing Trust Fund. We support economic development, energy and energy efficiency, planning. We're in growth management, as well as other aspects of community work. I'm going to be talking about this projection of housing need, a little bit more information there, and then information about the middle housing and ADU laws. So first, in 2021, well, before that, the legislature funded housing action plans. So Brian just talked about the housing action plan. It wasn't required. It's voluntary. It was grant funded. It was an activity to help communities plan for housing. And it provided some results, but I think the legislature wanted to speed that up. And they said, okay, Commerce, you're going to project need for the state. So we'll get some clear numbers on what those needs are. The legislature, we adopted the Growth Management Act in 1990. At that time, our population was 4.9 million. It just passed 8. And at that time, we were worried about overcrowding and threats to our quality of life and traffic. And so we adopted this act, which is a framework. It doesn't tell you exactly what to do. It says these are the steps that you have to step through at the local level decide what your population targets are going to be, how many housing units you're going to be, what kind of infrastructure you need, how you're going to plan for that. And this is the framework that everybody has to follow. The update timeline has changed, but now it's every 10 years. And here we are 30 years later, and we're really focusing in on housing at this point. So 1220 said, Commerce, you're going to project this housing need. We've always had to identify sufficient land capacity. How many units are you going to need? How much land does that take? And before it was just numbers. It didn't look at housing by income band. Now we have to document barriers, like what are the problems to producing more housing? And then look at racially disparate impacts. You know about redlining, right? So there are communities that were redlined, certain people of color were excluded. They're still excluded just on patterns of generational wealth. They are 20 points below in home ownership. So what we are doing as communities is understanding what those patterns are in our own community and then adopting policies such as looking at areas of large lot exclusionary zoning and trying to begin to undo that. On the right of this slide, you'll see the income bands. And so that's how we typically look at housing, and that's a national model. Extremely low is those earning under 30% of area median income. And so 100% of area median income means you earn the median. Half the people earn above that, and half of the people earn below that. So when you're talking about 50% AMI, that's the lowest quartile, the community, the population that earns the lowest 25% of the population. Above 120%, they can take care of themselves. And as our other speaker said, in the middle, maybe the market can provide. Below 50% AMI, we're talking public housing is needed. And we projected, based on the Office of Financial Management's median projection, so they provide a low and a high, and communities or counties choose between that. Generally, they pick around the medium, and looked at underproduction. We took the recreational units, group quarters, a healthy vacancy rate, and through that understood that we needed 1.1 million housing units, and that's based on the 2020 census. And you'll see that the housing type differs according to income level. If you are earning over 120, you can probably afford a single-family housing unit. We know that very few single earners can afford that right now. You usually require 2 earners for young people starting out. At 120 to 80, that's multiplex middle housing. Maybe you can afford a townhouse. Below that, you're generally looking at multifamily housing or existing housing or that manufactured house that is out in the county that's already existing. But it's very hard to provide new housing at that lower level without any public subsidies. We also need 91,000 emergency housing beds. So that's statewide, recognizing that even if we had housing units for everyone, there's still going to be people that get evicted, victims of domestic violence, or there's going to be transition. So there's always going to be some need for that transitionary and emergency housing. So Clark County did this, they selected between middle, low, and high, they selected a certain number of population growth based on what they saw as units and put it through our model. We have a model that, I'll share you the webpage, that produced over 100,000 housing units, which is a significant increase, as our speakers talked about. So cities and counties, they need to plan for and accommodate the housing. They don't need to build it, but it used to be just encouraged. The goal changed in 2021 to be planned for and accommodate. So that does put a lot more onus on the city to make sure that there's enough zoning for, 40, 50,000 apartments. Make sure that you have enough multifamily housing to allow units for that many multi-unit housing pieces. Make sure you have 40,000 lots for those single-family houses. So that would mean for plan for. And look at the barriers and incentives and all the things that Brian talked about to help encourage that housing for the lower income levels, well, at all income levels. And as I said, that the housing type varies by the income. Permanent supportive housing, if you don't know that's housing that has services attached to it. So it's for people who may not be able to live independently, may need check-ins and support to keep them in housing. We know that housing first helps people stabilize and have more successful lives. So you are just starting out the process of updating your comprehensive plan. That's a process that you have done many times. It's a little bit more housing focused. So how much growth do you need? Where's that going to go? We've got a corridors model in Vancouver. How much land do you need? You're probably going to have to change the zoning to allow that multifamily housing that's needed. What are the barriers? Create an action plan to reduce those, and then look at your policies. And throughout that, as we're doing tonight, engaging the community in those conversations about how we accommodate housing for all of our neighbors. So what's this going to be? Maybe some, probably, very likely potential changes in zoning, potential changes in policies at the comprehensive plan level, and then various actions to identify how your housing might change and what actions the city's already done most of the ones in our list. How do you bring that housing to the market more quickly? And so where in your communities might you see that housing? Well, if you have significant investments in public transit, it's really irresponsible not to provide additional opportunities there. And those are also areas of opportunity where people who may not have the income to afford personal vehicles, they need to have housing so that they have access to transit, access to jobs, access to transportation. Within walking distance of jobs and services, we do want to see more of a housing jobs balance, so that reduce our transportation climate. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions is another state goal, and luckily they dovetail very nicely. And then within our existing neighborhoods, I'll talk about some new legislation. It's very likely there's a lot of space in existing neighborhoods with existing infrastructure already. How do you benefit from that and add more people in a low impact way so that you can take advantage of what the city has already invested in? There is this 5-year implementation report for cities over 6,000, and that's kind of a benchmarking report. The city of Vancouver has decided to do some, invest in a dashboard to track metrics. And other cities will look at what the data is telling us. Are we making progress? How many housing units are we producing? How many are accessory dwelling units? How many are middle housing? What the affordability is? So we'll be looking that over time. What are the permit processing timelines? How fast are we getting the permits out of the door? What are their streamlined processes to do for? And there's also a piece that looks at our greenhouse gas emissions. Because we keep adding people. How do we add people in ways that we can afford and reduce the incremental impact as we continue to add people? Because Washington's a beautiful place. People keep moving here because of our climate, our economy, and the natural beauty. How many moved here in the last 10 years? Not? How many in the last, so 10 years or sooner. So most of you have been here for a while. We do keep growing. Okay, let's talk about some of the stuff that happened in 2023, which is a departure from the way the state has typically acted. Usually we adopt plans, they're presumed valid upon adoption. There hasn't been a lot of state top-down mandates. This is pretty new for our state. Middle housing means buildings that are compatible in scale with single family, but have 2 or more units in a single building. So a duplex and triplex, we know about those. Townhouses, stacked flats where they're in a row, which we have the condo issue. So those are not very popular. Courtyard apartments, which sound just as lovely as they seem, apartments around an open courtyard. Cottage housing means very small housing generally around a small center, so that the units are smaller. You can put more units within a given parcel of land. That's middle housing. We already exists. We have it in many of our neighborhoods already. Pre-World War II, here's a kit. For $3,000, you got everything, including the paint and the weights for your windows to produce 4 units. There's communities in our state, Walla Walla, Pasco, Spokane just adopted middle housing, Kirkland, they've all had middle housing on the books for several years, up to 5 years for Kirkland, for responding to the market's need for more units and more smaller units. The findings in the bill that responded to the housing crisis, responded to this need to meet 1 million new homes. They wanted more housing options, more options for that are affordable by design, because you're sharing walls, they're smaller units, they're smaller lots that they're on, and reduced energy and transportation costs for the households that live in these units. There are 77 communities statewide that have to adopt policies consistent with middle housing. So those over 25,000 have to allow a certain number of units per lot. And those smaller that are contiguous, that share a common border with the largest city, also have to allow 2 units per lot. And when is this required? 6 months after the periodic update deadline. So the pink one is for Vancouver. You're a city over 75,000. You need to allow 4 dwelling units per lot on all lots, and 6 if 2 are affordable, which seems like a lot. But where this is already allowed, it's very slow. Minneapolis allowed this. They had 45 units in the first 3 years. Because middle housing you need an empty lot, or you need a lot that has a tear down. You need a developer that's ready to develop middle housing. We expect slow implementation, but it's a huge opportunity for you, especially around transit, to provide housing that can be affordable to that middle income of your population. You have to allow 6 of the 9 middle housing types that we talked about. You can't have design standards that are more restrictive than single family. And there are requirements in the bill that limits the amount of parking that can be required by the city, because parking is a huge impact on the cost of housing. It reduces the yield you can get on a lot. And so you can get fewer units if you require more parking. If you have 3 units, you could have a whole front yard full of parking. So if you are near transit, within a half mile, and people can take the bus, there's an opportunity to reduce the traffic as you add that incremental household. And that is in the state law. Surprisingly, your parking standards are statewide legislation. The other bill I want to talk about is accessory dwelling units, that each community within an urban growth area, so that's all of the cities, have to allow at least two accessory dwelling units. So an accessory dwelling unit is a housing unit that has all the things for sleeping, bathing, cooking, living. And so within a lot, you could have freestanding or a basement or an attic or above a garage. The state legislation sets the size of these at 1,000 square feet. They must be allowed to be sold as independent units. So think about if you want your kid to have their own house, you can build one in the lot next door or at your neighbor's lot. And sell them a house. So all of a sudden, they can gain the benefits of ownership, where that may not have been possible if they had to buy an entire single-family house on a lot. The parking was tied by the legislature to that for middle housing, and impact fees have to be reduced because they are smaller units. Generally, 1 to 2 people living in those instead of a house that may have 4 or 5 bedrooms. Again, the deadline for the update is the end of December 2025, or June, and then the ADUs have to be allowed by then. But as someone said, you can choose to implement this sooner. There's a couple other bills I wanted to share. I have a whole document on my website that has all the laws in the last 4 years, and it's 18 to 20 pages long. 5258 was the proportional impact fees, and to allow that unit lot subdivision or the subdivision off of separate middle housing and ADU lots. 1042 allows conversion of existing buildings to residential. So it works for smaller office buildings or smaller commercial that you can turn them into residential. With so many people working at home, so much online retail, there's a lot of buildings that it could be 20 years before they're filled up, and with such a need for housing, there could be an opportunity to provide residences in those. 1293 takes a look at how we regulate design. Often it's a longer process. So the legislature said, well, we should have just clear standards And then staff, professional staff, look at the standards, look at the building. If it matches, they get the approval rather than holding up the process, because the longer development takes, the more money it costs. 1695 looked at surplus property for affordable housing, which the state constitution says that for affordable housing, or we can give away public funds for the benefit of the poor and infirm. And so affordable housing is considered a public benefit. And so there is a provision, and also one clearly in state law, that instead of having to dispose of surplus property at market rates, you can give it away for $1 so that someone can develop it for affordable housing, or whatever price you set. 1337 said affordable housing development on religiously owned property, they should have a bonus density. So the city of Bellevue, they're like, where's all our churches? Okay, let's zone them at 30 units per acre. The city can choose how they implement that law, but there should be the legislature said there should be a bonus density if it's owned by a religious organization, which doesn't pay property taxes already. 5491, this was kind of a big change. You can have a single stairway to serve multifamily residential structure. That can be a significant cost savings. And there's a couple more. 5290 is changes to procedures for permit processing. We have some grant funds and other programs to help communities. Some of them are just getting from paper processing to electronic, and some of them to help them improve the efficiency of their permitting process. And then 1181, of course, is the climate element, which communities are going to have to look at how they their production of greenhouse gases and think about ways to reduce them. This is our webpage. It's www.commerce.wa.gov, planning for housing. There's like 5 pages with a wealth of resources. You can look at much more detailed requirements for housing element updates. We have some videos that we created to talk about these concepts. Middle housing resources, we have the model ordinances, which we've produced. I have a paper copy here, that are expected to become, if cities don't adopt local rules that are consistent with the model ordinances, they become what middle housing is permitted against. And then that list of housing laws that I talked about. And also a public opinion survey that we conducted a year ago statewide that showed that all across our state, everyone is concerned about housing and amenable to many of these ideas, more dense middle housing. And that's consistent across the state. With that, thank you very much for the opportunity to come and talk about these things.
Okay, thank you very much to the panel, and we do have time for Q&A, and I see someone right here, and we're going to have people going around with microphones, so put your hand up again. There you go.
If I understood correctly, you can have a couple of ADUs on a property, and there's no requirement for street infrastructure. How does that work out? I mean, I'm all for the housing, but you can't ignore the streets, whether it's for parking or just getting people in and out, because you put 2 ADUs, you've tripled your density, and no changes to the street. So what are you doing about that?
That is in the legislation that generally there may be requirements for increased sidewalks, for increased changes. I think the thought is if you're adding a basement suite, what is the difference between 3 people living in one interjoined house and a house where one person lives above and one person lives below? There definitely may be a need at some point for increased water service, fire flow, as you add more units. The cities that have already done this, Walla Walla, Kirkland, they're like, we haven't actually seen any impacts yet. Maybe towards the end of the 20-year planning period, you will see, and certainly where there's gaps in things like sidewalks, for safe walks to school, you may want to think about how you're going to improve those.
Just one more response to that from the city perspective. We're doing a lot of things to make our streets move more people. And so that means, yes, continuing to support folks driving, but also buses move a lot more people. So supporting high capacity transit, putting in what we call mobility lanes. So that's lanes for people using all kinds of things these days. So typically bicycles, but also now scooters and other electric devices that are, they take up less space on the road. They have way less greenhouse gas impacts. So we're trying to really emphasize, like, we've got existing infrastructure and how do we use it to move more people as well. So we're transportation and land use go together. You're absolutely right.
Hello, my name is Monica Zazueta. I was wondering if you all knew about the Seattle social housing developer through Initiative 135. If you knew about that one yet, I would love to read it for you. It is, Seattle created the Seattle Social Housing Developer through Initiative 135 in 2023, where social housing is removed from the profit motive, available to all incomes, permanently affordable, and held as a public good in perpetuity. And their 4 pillars of social housing are publicly owned, social housing is publicly financed and controlled, with the express aim of housing people, not extract profit. Renters in their homes are shielded from the free market with specific measures prohibiting the sale and the marketization of social housing to ensure it remains in the public's hands for public use. 2, permanently affordable. Under a social housing model, rent is not determined by the market and profit motives. Rent is determined by the building's loan balance, upkeep, and maintenance needs. 3, cross-class communities. Social housing is available to all, from those with the lowest incomes up to the moderate to high income households. Rents are designed to match the specific home income levels of all tenants. And then 4, resident leadership. Residents have democratic decision-making over making power and having control over the conditions of their buildings and homes. And so it's a paradigm shift. I have that information, and I have 6 other resources that I would love to share with you and get together with you about, because we need to be a regenerative by design economy, and we need to meet the needs of all people within the means of the planetary boundaries, because inequality is a policy choice. So we are the creators of our reality, so we need to change what we're doing. So thank you.
Margaret?
I'm wondering about the street impacts, but specifically the parking. Do we have any local data about on-street parking after an apartment complex opens up? Like, does it increase? How much does it increase? Is there enough? Does parking not increase on the street? Is there typically enough parking in the parking areas?
I don't think we have comprehensive data on that across the city.
We are undertaking a parking study for downtown. It's more of a comprehensive, study of kind of how do we utilize our existing parking assets, and so understanding the impact of development, particularly development that increasingly has less parking, what that impact is, and how we plan for that. So we may get some data out of that, and I know anecdotally, my team includes the parking division, and we manage the downtown parking, and so we hear anecdotally some of the conflicts, but I don't have data. We don't have data to really answer your question and the way you're asking it.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, anecdotally, probably, across the board, multifamily housing probably does increase some on-street parking. To what degree, it's hard to say. I think it's probably project by project. I think what's important to note is on-street parking is public good. It doesn't belong to anybody. And so if it's able to support more housing that gets more people in homes, I think that's a policy choice about how you use a public resource.
Okay, yeah, I think, so what I'm picturing, like in a neighborhood that isn't used to it and that has apartments or ADUs put in, when I see a lot of on-street parking, I start to worry about safety issues of kids and, other folks that are in the area of the street or in the street. And when there's just a lot of parking along the street, it just seems like there's a higher risk. So That's why and
Yeah.
when this comes up in other discussions, I hear a lot of national statistics, which is why I'm curious if we have local statistics.
There is a provision in the state law about parking where it appears unsafe. We have a consultant working on that right now. So that might be something you look at on our website probably in about 4 months.
Yeah, I'll say from the transportation side, there isn't data or correlation that we see between on-street parking and safety issues. Obviously, roadway design varies greatly, but oftentimes on-street parking will slow down cars and can be used as a way to calm traffic. Not in every situation, though. Depends on the road.
Hi, is there a plan by any chance to have a set of maybe 5 or 10 different pre-approved ADU plans on the website so that it kind of gives some guidance to people that already want to have those designs or can kind of cut the costs down? I've seen this in San Francisco, San Jose, Seattle that's had this plan that people can kind of pick whatever one they want. They can kind of cut the costs of development down. Has that kind of been implemented at all or an idea?
Yes, it is an idea. And I would say, I don't know if you were here for Patrick's presentation, but we'll send the recording out. But that falls into the innovation bucket. Is how do you sort of do some things that really make it easier, facilitate a quick process to add ADUs. We haven't done that yet, though, but we should.
Yeah, we're definitely aware of those other models in the jurisdiction, so it's something to look at.
Back to the central question, which I thank you for your question and also for yours. I live in Carter Park. This issue about, I'm getting more out of this meeting this evening than I realized. In my residential house, we have 7 residents, and there's 8 cars on the street that we generate. The apartment complex right next to us, which was put in recent years, has their cars parking, at least 2 of them, on our street also, because there's inadequate parking for them. I'm surprised that I was so ignorant to this issue that if you put an ADU in, you have to worry about access, where you put the automobiles. So I would encourage you to look at what I never thought about, which is where are you going to put the damn auto? Along our street now, again, we generate 8 cars from one house, and you have at least 2 from next door. It takes up the whole length of the street. Thanks.
Hello. Just given all the negative impacts of exclusionary zoning in this country over the last 96 years, why would Vancouver keep any exclusionary zoning on the books in this comp plan?
Well, we do not intend to. So we are obligated, obviously under state law, but we have very good reasons, as well as Patrick and Mike have outlined, to open up single-family zones to more and different types of housing, and we are going to do that. So we'll be working with the community to talk about that, develop standards for that. As Ann mentioned, you can't have standards that are more restrictive, design standards that are more restrictive than what you do for a single-family house. And you obviously need to sort of moderate what you're doing with parking. So I think we do not want to have exclusionary housing anymore. We understand that having 50% of your city zoned for single-family development has led to where we are in terms of a housing crisis. We've only allowed housing in some places, and everywhere else just hasn't had to absorb any of what we need. And so I think the answer is we wouldn't.
Should we do breakout groups?
Any other questions? Oh, Peggy's got a question.
I'm wondering how you guys are coordinating all this work with the other cities in the county.
Did you hear me? Do you want me to talk? I'm pretty loud. Yeah, it would help.
Well, I can say, so on the land use side, we coordinate really closely with the county because they're the ones who select the population and then allocate it to the various jurisdictions And they also they select a jobs target as well and then allocate that. So we're coordinating with them, and we have obviously coordinate with the other cities in Clark County as well. I think for Vancouver, how I see our role is to lead. We're the biggest city by a lot, and we have the opportunity in terms of the staffing expertise and the resources to really lead and show other jurisdictions what you can do in this area. I will say, though, that the smaller cities are doing a lot. Washougal had cottage housing 5 years before we did. We copied them. So I think there's an opportunity to collaborate, but in this sort of round, I think Vancouver needs to lead, and we need to work with our partners across jurisdictions to show what you can do to increase housing, but as Patrick has said, pull all the levers.
And I think, Peggy, you would know as well as anybody, but there are people in the room Samantha Whitley, who's our housing programs manager, I know, and the VHA folks are here, there's a lot of collaboration with the county, and particularly in trying to establish priorities, communicating the housing needs of the county and Southwest Washington to the state. So there is that collaboration, trying to understand so that everybody knows what they're doing. And certainly for people who don't know, the Vancouver Housing Authority is not just building housing in Vancouver. They build affordable housing throughout Southwest Washington. So there could always be more collaboration, but there is work that's happening between the city and the county and other communities.
I'll also say just one more response is for folks who don't know, there is the city of Vancouver, and then is what's called our urban growth area. And that is a huge chunk of land about the same size of the city that's currently in the county, but is designated as a place that will develop at urban densities and will eventually come into the city. So another way that we're coordinating is working with the county to try to encourage zoning that is meeting the housing needs in that area, because it will one day be in the city. And so wanting to see a diversity of housing types and sizes, more density, more proximity to things you can walk to, services in the urban growth area, because that's going to be part of the city one day. So we're collaborating in that way as well.
All right, so I'm mainly here to educate myself, and I'm now going to ask a very naive question. So when you said exclusionary housing, it took me a couple of beats to figure out that means single family detached housing, right? This phrase exclusionary housing. Okay, and then somebody else said that the new law means we won't have single family detached zone, right? So what is going on in my brain is that I feel like we've tended to look at things like on a continuum. We want a continuum of choices in the city. What I'm hearing is we're taking one of the choices off the table. So that part of my question is that true or false? And then if it's true, I think then what you said was the rule doesn't apply to cities less than 25,000. So if a person wants that choice, they just need to move to a city with less than 25,000. So are both those statements true? Again, very naive.
Let me respond. So none of this bans single-family housing. It allows a greater. Right. You can still build a single-family house if you can choose to build a duplex or a triplex, or you build a single-family house and 2 dwelling units. There are choices.
But there's not a choice. There won't be a choice in Vancouver to live in a single-family zone.
It's going to be a low-density zone.
Yeah, I think in terms of the zoning and what is allowed, the zones will allow more than just single-family houses only to comply with state law. But keep in mind, 50% of the city is single-family houses. And when you look at other jurisdictions, California, Oregon, who have done middle housing, right, it's very slow. It's very incremental. ADUs can go a little faster, but no one, we're not going to, the fundamental nature of neighborhoods is not going to like change rapidly. You'll see a little bit here and a little bit there, but that is an important piece of meeting the targets that Patrick said, because what we've done over the last 10 years, right, is we've put almost all of our new housing in centers and corridors. And we've asked places like the 4th Plain Corridor, the Mill Plain Corridor, 112th, as you know, to absorb a lot of housing. And what this is saying is we got to spread it out, right? Like parts of the city, every part of the city has to do something to help. And actually what Ann is telling you about is the legislature is saying every part of the state has got to do something about this, because housing markets don't end at the edge of a city, right? It is, we see people getting displaced to Cowlitz County, to Longview, to Kelso, because housing here is so expensive. And so what the state has said is we're raising the bar. The baseline is higher because we all got to do our part, because we don't fix this at a city level. We don't fix it at a regional level. It is, statewide, West Coast issue. So there will still be lots of single family housing, and you can still build it. It won't go away.
Thank you all for the great information. When I hear the term comprehensive, that means more than just the plan to build the housing. That means the staffing, the code enforcement, the law enforcement, the emergency services, the hospitals, the schools. Is that all? I know we're not here to talk about all that in detail, but is that all part of this, and where can we learn more?
Excellent question. Yes, comprehensive does mean comprehensive. So we're focused on housing tonight because it is such a big topic and need. But there are lots of elements to the comprehensive plan. So we'll look at, as we've talked about, land use and housing. We'll also look at economic development, jobs. We'll look at transportation. We'll look at parks and open space. We'll look at capital facilities, is what you're talking about. So what are the fire stations, police stations, water infrastructure, stormwater, sewer, all the stuff that we need to grow in a way that is compatible with state law, because we always do that, but also meets the needs of the citizens and ensures that the city continues to be livable and function, and we're doing service delivery. Yep. And you can learn more about it at, what is the what? So you should go to at least one stop at the how to get involved table at the comprehensive plan.
I just wanted to make one quote, and it's something that I learned. It's Mother Earth never asked us for rent. So I'm just a little confused at why is it for profit still and not for people. And so I just wanted to say that, like, really think about that. Like, I didn't come out of my mama kicking and screaming, and for Mother Earth to say, okay, now pay me rent. So I just think we really need to look at each other as human beings that are different shades with different problems that are suffering in different ways, and that we really need to come together and work together and care for each other, because there should be no such thing as a houseless human. So thank you.
See no other hands raised. Yeah. Last question, because we want to get you all into breakout groups.
Always the last question. So kind of dovetailing off this gentleman's question earlier, we talk about how to move things forward, and that's what this whole meeting is about. And yet when addressing how to move quickly, what I heard was all these regulations and things that get in the way. How do we get out of that box? How do we think globally? If there were to be a huge disaster in this area, there would be an immediate response, and we would move differently. How do we remove the roadblocks to moving quickly? Because quickly, as I heard it, is years or many months. We don't have to do that. We can move quickly. How do we remove the roadblocks?
I mean, I think we could have a big conversation about that. I think one of the first constraints is resources in terms of what's available locally. We believe we're trying to do the create the best formula for building housing as quickly as possible, given the resources that we have at our disposal. We're as I outlined, we're marshaling a lot of different sources of funding to bring to this issue. I think it's dramatically higher than it was, 10 years ago. To have the kind of response that you're talking about, and maybe the kind of response you're talking about, like I referenced what it was like 50 years ago, that people, like public housing in this country was built by the federal government, funded by the federal government at levels that we can't even imagine right now. So absent that level of resources, we think we're doing as much as we can, but we're open to whatever ideas people have about how to either grow the resource base or to create more leverage with the resources we have. But the current system we have requires kind of public-private coming together and using the resources that we have. So I think that's the approach we're taking. But we would be happy to have conversations with folks at the state level and our federal representatives about how we can grow the funding base to do something more dramatic. It's not something that we have access to right now.
I'd also add the problem we're in took decades for us to get in, and I think the reality is, to Patrick's point, unless we're dramatically changing the system and the level of resource, it's going to take us some time to get out. So the pull every lever approach is like, let's get out of this as soon as we can. But your metaphor about emergency response, right? An emergency happens, we're going to respond. But how long is it going to take us to build the city back that was? It'll take a long time, because we have what we have now. It took time to create. It was, we had these zoning policies in place for a very long time that got us into this problem of not having enough housing. It's going to take some time for us to get out of it. But yeah, any ideas? And talk to your elected officials. So, okay, we want to leave some time for breakout groups. So there are little tents on all the tables that have different topics, and there will be staff at different tables to kind of facilitate and answer your questions. You can hop around. So if you want to talk about home ownership first, then you can talk about state laws with our commerce folks. So we've got, let's see, state laws, we've got affordable housing, we have multifamily housing, we have home ownership, we have middle housing. And then we have learn about the comprehensive plan, because it should be comprehensive, over here. So, and also, so feel free to get up, move around, talk to staff. Also, please eat. There's a lot of food. Thanks, guys.